Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the Polsky Center's Entrepreneurial Outlook on Diagnostic Health. My name is Nima Merchant, and I'm a Senior Associate Director at the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. I'm thrilled to be able to kick off today's fantastic panel, the second in our series of 5. Last week, we had a really timely discussion on sustainable energy, and I'm confident that this week's panel will be just as informative. If you could, please be sure to check into this event with the link in the chat. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, the Entrepreneurial Outlook was created to look at the year ahead for new opportunities, innovation, and trends. We have brought together entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, innovators, and ecosystem partners to provide us a multifaceted perspective and discussion. Today's event on diagnostic health will be followed up by our event on media and entertainment next Friday from noon to 1. We will continue to host these series each Friday through the end of February, and our remaining topics include cybersecurity and food innovation. Please be sure to check in to this event with a link in the chat. The Entrepreneurial Outlook series is generously supported by the law firm Loeb & Loeb, so we'd like to give them a special thanks for today's event and sponsoring this entire series. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Christine Karslake. Christine joined the Polsky Center in December as our new managing director of the Polsky Science Ventures. Christine brings more than 10 years of venture capital experience and has worked across life science businesses, including startups and publicly traded global companies. Thank you to our wonderful set of panelists and for giving us their time. And Christine, with that, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Nima. So welcome to the latest edition of the Polsky Entrepreneurial Outlook series. Today, we're going to be exploring the topic of health diagnostics. We ask that you hold your questions to the end because our panelists will have some fabulous insights. And joining me today will be these amazing panelists, and they include Arun Bhatia, received his MBA from Booth in 2006, and he is the Open Innovation and Startup Engagement Lead at Roche. Kendall received his MBA in 2016 from Booth, and he is a senior associate at Arch Venture Partners. Savas Tay is a PhD, and he's an associate professor of molecular engineering at the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering. And Annalisa Samira. Annalisa has a Master's of Science, an MBA, and a Master's of Public Health, and she's currently the CEO of Rayos, which is a startup in this space. And she's also a mentor at Polsky Center. And as Nima mentioned, I'm Christine Karslake. And without much further ado, let's get started. So for each of the panelists, we've noticed that there's been a lot of change in this health diagnostic space in the past few years. So I'm wondering if you could start by highlighting one or two trends that you've seen in the recent years. And I'll start with Arun.
Terrific. Thank you, Christine, and glad to be here. So health diagnostics is obviously a large bucket. So any trends we talk about, may apply more so to one segment versus another. But let me just share a couple that I know I have started paying attention to. So one is, we've talked a lot, folks have heard this term, greater emphasis on, and I would say scrutiny on value and clinical utility. And we've sort of evolved from this point where we're just focused on, does the diagnostic work? Does the product work? But I think diagnostics are sort of along this path of, first they're informative, then they're diagnostic, then they're prognostic. And so understanding the value that they bring is really important. And there's increased, again, scrutiny on really understanding what value they bring. The other piece that is maybe not so well known from a trend perspective, I think, is really understanding how diagnostics fit in the workflow of a user and how they actually connect even with other diagnostics and other therapies. And so a big trend really that we're seeing a lot of among startups and big companies is the evidence that we need to demonstrate things like workflow integration and connection to other diagnostics on top of the already hard job of actually demonstrating that your diagnostic actually works. So that's one big trend. And I would say the second big trend that we pay a lot of attention to is, with the decreasing costs of diagnostics and some of the technology that goes into it, some of these pieces, diagnostic pieces, have become decentralized, right? We're shifting a lot of these things from large labs to point of care sites to even to the home. Not all diagnostics, but a lot has made that transition. And as a result of that, a lot has become more personalized. So that personalization and precision approach is really a big trend. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have one tool for one person, but that tool actually provides me, very specific information and value that's specific to me. And so underlying, I think, both of those trends is a much deeper understanding of things like customer value and seeing them more as a disease, but actually understanding how they're using these tools. So lots of other trends, but those are two that I'm sort of paying attention to.
Thank you, Arun. Next, we'll go to Sean.
Great. I'd say our lens on things tends to oftentimes start with the scientific perspective and what we're seeing in terms of innovation in the academic landscape. So I would say that one big trend that we've been seeing is, as we see, I'd say it's both an increase in complexity as well as a certain sort of refinement. And what I would say is behind that is that we have newer tools that are giving us deeper insight into biology than ever before at lower cost, higher throughput, and just bringing immense amounts of information. At the same time, this is being married with a lot of developments in the computational sciences and so on. And so we're able to not just generate information like never before, but also interpret it. And I would say that helps us, really connect across data sets. And so while we can get a better look at the complexity of disease and to really understand the layers upon layers upon layers of biology and start to get a better look at networks and things that are much more complex than just an individual biomarker, at the same time, we're gaining a better ability to hone down what some of those biomarkers or the phenotypes that we might see might mean in terms of the complexity of the underlying biology. So we're getting better and better at differentiating across disease states and boiling this down into more precise medicine.
Fabulous. Okay, Savas, it's your turn.
Hi, yeah, sure. So I'm approaching the question from an academic perspective, and I think we really need to divide this between pre and post-COVID. Obviously, everything has changed since past year. So prior to COVID, what we observed in the academic research in biomedicine is cancer has been the driving force. So cancer research has been the main topic. Everybody spent a lot of time on it. And the technologies really that drive cancer diagnostics and research has been, like Sean mentioned, these high throughput, highly multiplex, high dimensional measurements provided by omics technologies, something like genomics, transcriptomics, new and more recently, and even proteomics. And for their interpretation and prediction use of computational modeling, or computational analysis, such as machine learning, deep learning. These have been the driving forces prior to COVID. Obviously, with COVID, things have changed a little, and I think for good, in that now the field has a better understanding of the importance of infectious disease research. So infectious disease right now is king. That may change again once COVID is gone. That's one of the important takeaways. And the second thing is the necessity to do team science. So bringing in engineers, chemists, biologists, doctors to do focused research. Now, the technologies that are driving, obviously, this new infectious disease research is, on one hand, there are vaccines and drug development. But on the testing side, we are looking into two types of testing. One is rapid testing. And everything else could be probably categorized under better testing. So, more sensitivity, more accuracy, higher throughput, and also easier to perform, such as like saliva testing versus nasal swabs or at-home testing. These are some of the things that drive current research. And of course, using computation to make predictions, interpret the data, understanding how patients can be stratified and treated.
That's great. Thank you. And last, Annalisa.
Great. So Christine, I'll answer your question more from an entrepreneurial lens. And in terms of trends, I can speak more towards diagnostic medical devices because that's the world I've been a part of for the past 16 years. And really the trends that I see in this space are really in the wearables and wearables that can be used either in the hospital or in the home. And with regards to the latter, as you can imagine, during the pandemic, there has definitely been an appeal for home-based wearables. And we know whether it's hospital or home, those wearables that do well are the ones that have strong value propositions, kind of to Arun's point. So, these value propositions, they need to address unmet needs for the different stakeholders within the technology's ecosystems. And that could be, the unmet needs of patients, payers, providers, and hospitals.
Wow, fabulous. A lot to think about there in the trends that have been occurring the last few years. So Arun, we've touched on payers, and we've noticed that payers are playing a much bigger role in diagnostic testing and what gets approved and what gets placed into a hospital. Because of this, has there really been any movement in the willingness to pay for prevention versus treatment?
Yeah, for sure, payers are playing an increasing role, and actually just to define payers, really, we've thought about it as, Medicare or commercial insurance payers, but even large organizations, enterprises, self-insured employers are themselves kind of starting to play this role. They're investing in these types of solutions for their employees, so they're making these decisions as well, and that's important to keep in mind. We always talk about this shift from like fee-for-service to value-based care. So I think that shift, which is still happening, has created these incentives, both carrots and sticks, to invest in prevention, or at least earlier, diagnosis. And obviously they're looking for things that improve quality of life, quality of care, and reduce long-term costs. I think for payers, there's a couple of interesting challenges, and there's an interesting paradox in here, which is, if I'm a payer or an employer, for me to invest in a long-term prevention solution for my member or my employee today doesn't necessarily help me reap benefits 10 years from now when that member is on a different insurance plan or is working for a different employer. Right. We see this in diabetes care. I work at Roche Diabetes Care, where we think about, a risk is cardiovascular health and diabetes. Well, that's a risk that may not play out for 10 to 15 years. So the question is, to what extent do we look at investing in those types of prevention solutions if I don't reap the benefits from that? And so I think one interesting thing to start thinking about is, yes, there's an interest in prevention, but I call it in shorter time windows or shorter time increments. Can I see return on those investments, within 1, 2, 3 years? That's one thing that I'm probably thinking about as a payer or as an employer. I think the other challenge that's also maybe inhibiting or slowing this sort of all-in push towards prevention is that I think as we get smarter about science and human health, we're realizing there's not a one-to-one correlation between preventing one thing or addressing one thing and preventing one disease, right? Unlike in oncology, where you do have a little bit more of that one-to-one correlation. I think of these diseases as kind of like the water hose in your backyard that has, multiple holes in it. If you think about all those holes as causing disease, you can cover up one hole, but you're going to have water coming out of the other, 49 holes. So part of understanding prevention is to say you have to take a little bit more of a holistic approach to really understanding prevention. So investing in one preventative tool may not necessarily guarantee success. And that's where there's a little bit more of a, I think from an industry side, a push to developing a platform approach Using diabetes as an example, we're addressing diabetes, but we're also thinking about how do we address cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, eye disease, all of the things that are sort of associated with that. So yes, there will be this continued push towards prevention, but I think as entrepreneurs and industry, we're thinking about how to look at that in shorter time increments and more defined value propositions and return.
Have you seen any examples that have been forerunners of what we might begin to see in terms of prevention?
Yeah, it's very challenging. I think it depends on the space that you're in. I'll maybe say it generally. I think where we see opportunities are in spaces where there are actually, if you think about that spectrum that I talked about before of a diagnostic being informative to diagnostic to prognostic, areas where there are a lot of therapy solutions, where a clinician, a provider has a lot of different choices that they can make for a patient. Those are the spaces where I think diagnostics that can help say, okay, of these 10 options, these 3 based on this patient, based on where they are in their disease, these 3 are sort of the frontline therapies or ways to target. I think those are the types of solutions that are really going to sort of play a role in this space.
That's great. And how do you think the industry will be shaped going forward with some of the prevention versus treatment paradigms?
Yeah, we're seeing a big push by a lot of companies who are, again, developing this, I'll call it maybe like the cockpit mentality, like in an airplane, where if you think about each individual metric as being a point solution, a startup point solution, the pilot in a cockpit has to kind of keep an eye on all of those things, kind of manage those things together, coordinate all of those solutions together. That's kind of the approach we're seeing from a lot of larger companies who are saying, let's take this platform approach, let's take this sort of higher level dashboard approach. So we need to figure out how all of these solutions connect to each other, how they work off of each other, but we're providing as part of that platform treatment solutions, diagnostic solutions, prevention solutions. So from a patient-facing perspective, the patient sees one holistic solution and they can kind of pick and choose, which solutions are right for them at the right time.
Okay, great. We're going to turn to Sean next and ask some questions that a venture capitalist would tend to see. So how has the increased involvement in payers affected investment?
I think being sure that there is payment for for a potential diagnostic is critical to us. Oftentimes, the path that we're going to take is through really a lot of the products that we might be working on that eventually become a diagnostic will start actually earlier being sold into the academic market and so on. So we'll hopefully have the ability to see over time the growth in the research market and academic applications and so on, and applications in disease, and then be able to inform payers and those who the academic market, the research market will start to show us the particular areas in which these new insights into biology will provide kind of deeper insight where they can be applied as a diagnostic. And so for us, oftentimes there's a little bit of a eventually we're having to inform, and we're trying to build up the base in the research market, and then over time inform payers for the applications that would be of most interest.
That sounds wonderful. Okay, next, are you seeing an increase in health diagnostics compared to other life sciences, things you might invest in, or how is this affecting venture capital funds?
I think we've been seeing a few different increases in a few different areas. I think again, speaking to kind of the side that we often work on, sort of the research insights that become the diagnostics of the future, we've seen a big explosion in that space. I think a number of the the technologies that are effectively like research tools. We've seen single cell genomics really taking off. We've seen single cell transcriptomics as well. We've seen methods for now, I think Nature methods of the year for 2020. We're now putting a lot of this in spatial context and so on. And while a lot of these, are not yet diagnostics, we think will really inform kind of the future of that. Also, these tools have really, I think, especially lately, been doing very well in the in acquisitions in public markets. So that we before, while it may not have been as lucrative an area, we've seen a recent explosion. So that's driven a fair amount of thesis in that space.
And Arun mentioned too some of the specialized or personalized medicine kinds of approaches. Are you seeing more deals in that space as well?
Yeah, I would say that most of these technologies do have applications really in boiling things down into that precision case. So being able to detect biomarkers at levels that we'd never been able to detect in the past, being able to really quantify what some of these mean in terms of the underlying complexity of disease, and to be able to separate and parse out different underlying biology in diseases that may have been united under one code in the past, I think has been a major trend in the space.
That's great. Thank you. So Savas, so like you mentioned, the world has seen this huge wake-up call this year in terms of everything that's happened with COVID-19. And infectious diseases have really become sort of the forefront of what we've been discussing in this last year. It's affected everything in our lives. And what would be your thoughts in terms of how we could better prepare for a pandemic in terms of the health diagnostics aspect?
Yeah, so it has been remarkable indeed. Everybody turned into a virologist / immunologist in the past year, which is great for us. So I think the important thing here is to understand that these pandemics are not a one-off event. We will have more. There are many viruses out there, including coronaviruses, in animal reservoirs, and we have more travel, more globalization, higher population density. So these things will come up, and we actually have seen them in increasing frequency in the past, right? So with MERS and SARS-1, we dodged a bullet in both of those cases. It was endemic, didn't go pandemic, but with SARS-CoV-2, now it is. So understanding that this is actually an important issue. And I just find that it's like an insane model to wait for these things to happen and then start responding and now forget it during inter-pandemic timeframes, right? So when between two pandemics, we forget about all this. So I think we have to take an approach like how the insurance companies are doing with global warming and readjust our strategies towards infectious disease and virology especially. So these are fairly well understood processes. I mean, basic microbiology, infectious disease, and immunology are well developed. It's not like cancer where questions are big and a lot of things are unknown. So we can actually make an impact and respond. If we respond in a timely manner, really prevent these things happening. So I would say the understanding that infectious disease is important. It needs to remain constant. We shouldn't go back to the normal, if you will, from a research perspective. And the second thing that we need to do is maintain the pipelines that we are now developing. So we are developing testing, drug development, prediction pipelines. Really amazing research is being done in the past year, but we should not go back to putting them into the back burner, and keep developing them, also maintain them as we move forward. And that can only happen with coming out with better business models. I mean, some of this needs to be done by academia and the governments, but we need to come up with a better business model where companies that are founded, say, on the diagnostics infectious disease diagnostics domain can be funded in between times during the downtime. And then when the pandemics hit, we are ready and we have all the tools and maybe even the therapies that we need to move forward with them.
That's great. Thank you for your insights. Annalisa, we're going to switch to you. You're currently a CEO of Rayos, and it's a company that's developed a platform thermal sensor technology that is initially leading with the monitoring of ventricular shunts and hydrocephalus, which is a chronic neurological condition. And as someone who's been part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem for a while, how do you see the health diagnostics positioned for venture capital investments?
Sure. I'm actually in the thick of fundraising right now. I'll probably be fundraising for the rest of my CEO lifetime and maybe beyond after Rayos. But anyway, there's definitely appeal by the investors for health diagnostics, especially those that have platform applications. And that backs up with what my colleagues just said, where industry and investors have an initial interest, may have an initial interest in one particular indication, but are interested in other areas as well. What else do you got under the hood? So think definitely platform and pipeline. But besides, these two things, the technologies that I think are well positioned for investment really need to demonstrate the value proposition. So you need to actually, demonstrate, show that you can what you say that you can do, and those value propositions must echo what the stakeholders are looking for, because essentially at the end of the day, that's what drives market adoption, widespread use, that sort of thing. And I think for health diagnostics, particularly skin contact wearables, because that's my world, they have the potential for relatively quick scalability, given their ease of use and ability to collect data quickly and oftentimes in real time. Yep. And I guess in terms of maybe some tips that I might provide for some entrepreneurs that are looking to fundraise or are fundraising, going through the struggle, I understand. What I will say is do a lot of customer discovery, and don't just leave it at the front end of your business. That's something that you should do throughout, because your business changes, you grow, that sort of thing. You learn things along the way. And I think it's really important to conduct these interviews throughout the life of the technology. It's really important to understand what these stakeholders are looking for, and not only on the surface knowing what their unmet needs are, but understanding why. Like, why are they facing the problems? So, if your technology can fill that gap, that would be great. And to help you along the way, there's definitely external consultants, whether if applicable, regulatory, reimbursement, usability engineers, et cetera, to get you there.
Wonderful, thank you. So Arun, Roche is a big player in the next-gen sequencing space, which is so tied to health diagnostics. And we've seen the costs of whole genome sequencing really plummet in the last decade to now we're under $1,000. I don't know, maybe you have a most recent update in terms of how much it is. But how is this going to be affecting some of the precision medicine approaches you alluded to earlier?
Yeah, it's definitely, the technology has certainly gotten less expensive. We do see a lot of different types of technologies like the 23andMe's out there that are that offer this type of testing. And as I mentioned before, I think a lot of that is also driving this shift from like the lab cores of the world doing tests in big labs to point of care, to home testing, to wearables, like Annalisa mentioned. I think if you think about if you buy the argument that we're moving, that the shift is happening, and that these diagnostics are trying to be better at the prevention side, or at least at the early wellness side, I think a couple of things that I think are driving the sophistication of these diagnostics. I think it goes back to that spectrum that I talked about, informative, diagnostic versus prognostic. I think as these tools get to be more and more sophisticated, they're going to move beyond just the informative phase, and they're going to be able to say, we're not only able to diagnose you with X condition, we're able to do it with more accuracy, we're able to do it with more precision. And we're also able to transition those tests into a prognostic space where not only have we diagnosed you, but we can now start to, based on that test, tell you what type of therapy, treatment, or next steps, you or your provider should be taking. So I think that's sort of the evolution, one evolution of some of these technologies. I think the other, and Annalisa referred to this, is this ability to, I would say, more continuously provide feedback, right? So it's not so much that, okay, in a point in time, you can diagnose me with a particular condition, but now if it's like diabetes as an example, how is that condition changing over time? How can my diagnostics sort of work with me in a more continuous manner to give me a more continuous feed on how am I doing in my diabetes, but also give me some feedback loop to say, hey, you are really hyperglycemic. This is what you need to do in terms of your diet, nutrition, exercise, or you're hypoglycemic. You really should be taking some insulin, right? So how is it actually how is it helping me make decisions going forward? So I would say those are the two areas where, from a sophistication standpoint, I see a lot of diagnostics heading in those directions.
Yeah, and we're even seeing a tie back to then treatment. For example, going back to diabetes within insulin pumps. So having that diagnostic catch the information and then be able to feed it to an insulin pump, which then automatically regulates that blood sugar in real time. So yeah, it's interesting because they're becoming so tightly intertwined in that particular space. Are there any other tools besides next generation sequencing, such as computational tools or other kinds of tools that are also driving diagnostics?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I definitely defer to my scientific colleagues who know the technologies way better than I do. But I will say we do see, computational biology playing a huge role. We've all heard, the role that data is playing, commoditized data, democratizing data to really understand how people with different conditions are reacting to different diagnostic tests. So we are developing tests in a way that's using sort of this crowdsourced model of really understanding large suites of data to say, how do we better develop these tests, develop these diagnostics in a way that's meeting the needs of the population. So for sure, next generation sequencing, anything as Sean mentioned, that's getting to the sort of the personalized root of someone's DNA and biology and physiology. Those are the kinds of tools that I think are going to play a bigger role in the diagnostic world. Okay,
great. Last quick question. So how can your venture capitalists, your industry researchers, your academic researchers, your entrepreneurs, how can they best work with industry to bring products forward?
Yeah, I think two things. One is going back to what I mentioned before about understanding where, how industry is approaching these solutions. First of all, I think big companies are becoming less point solution companies and are becoming more platform, holistic solution companies, right? So they are vertically integrating to understand not only how do we treat a disease, how do we diagnose it, what are the associated services and solutions and engagement solutions that we provide our patients. So they're becoming all holistic, and they have a number of other solutions in their platform. So I think for a startup, for a researcher, it's really important as you all are working on point solutions or particular diagnostics, understanding how your story fits within a company's broader story, where your solution fits relative to their overall solution. And one of the things we often preach when we're working with startups is really sit down and understand what is that shared vision of the future of care that you see. So when we talk, I'm going to pick on diabetes care, how do you see viewing that diabetes patient 10 years from now? Meaning you've got continuous glucose monitors, you've got other metrics that you're measuring, you've got other treatments, you've got ancillary solutions. So having a shared understanding of what that future could look like, or where at least that industry partner is looking to go, I think will help the startup better understand where their solution can fit. You're one or two pieces of a broader puzzle. So understanding what does that broader puzzle look like, and do you fit into that is really important. And then lastly, in terms of how you actually define evidence of your solution. Again, I think one thing that I see a big gap in between startups and industry is, on paper or in theory, we all agree with, here is the proposed value proposition. This is the value of our solution. But when you look at the evidence that a startup creates to say this is the evidence to that value, it often isn't answering a lot of the key questions for that industry partner. So I think sitting down and really saying what evidence is missing for that industry partner that would demonstrate that this has value proposition and that has potential, and are we doing the right experiments to answer those questions? And that's where I think industry and startups can work really well together to define those experiments, define those questions, run those pilots, and demonstrate the value of the solution.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you. Sean, I'm turning to you and wanting to ask you, in terms of some of the investments that have been made within the venture capital industry, what have been some of the really big ones that have changed the face of health diagnostics, both other venture capital funds and your own?
It's a great question. I mean, you mentioned NGS earlier, and I think that among other trends that we've seen that have really driven improvement in diagnostics, I think the NGS story speaks to some degree on this, more information, cheaper kind of element, or this scaling down element. And I think that there's been some real trends, either in terms of kind of within our own portfolio. I could speak to, while it's not a diagnostics company per se, the output of Twist Bioscience being able to generate huge libraries of oligonucleotides, either for many different research applications, but also for the development of diagnostics, or for making high fidelity standards for other diagnostics and so on, I think is one of many examples of what getting to small scale and high complexity can do for understanding a lot of these things. Quanterix would be another portfolio company that has really managed to scale down what is effectively a super sensitive single molecule ELISA. So, once you get down to that level, you start being able to detect biomarkers that you hadn't been able to really use in the past to detect disease at super early onset, or to look for markers themselves that were previously not terribly useful. And we've seen impact there already. Case in point with regard to the kinds of benefits you get from that kind of sensitivity is that Quanterix's technology is sensitive enough that you can start to detect brain biomarkers outside that have actually crossed the blood-brain barrier at very low amounts. So you can detect tau or neurofilament light or some of these biomarkers at very low levels. I think. So those would be a couple that I think we're particularly proud of, but I think that perhaps the underlying elements worth paying attention to there are really this the scaling down and this improved sensitivity.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. Okay, Sebas, we're going to turn to you and we're going to ask you, how has the discipline of university health diagnostics research changed maybe over the past 10 years? How do you anticipate it'll change in the future? And what are some of the hottest areas for research?
So in the past 10 years, and especially recently, I think one of the biggest differences is understanding the value of team science. So interdisciplinary science, and team research has been more and more emphasized, and especially with COVID, of course, now we are scrambling for solutions in a way that we have never done before. So some of the walls have been torn down, and I think that's only a positive trend. And prior to COVID, again, we have been very active in cancer research. Almost all the community has done some level of cancer work. And with this now, we better understand the importance and kind of prominence of infectious disease, because it can change everything in our lives. Some of the hottest research areas, it was mentioned before, genomics and omics, generally speaking, signal cell transcriptomics have been very hot and useful. Although in interpretation of that kind of data for useful, like diagnostics and treatment, depend on basic science understanding as well as computational analysis and interpretation. So computation, I think, will play a major role more and more so, especially with the advent of machine learning and deep learning type approaches. Lab on a chip technologies, microfluidics that enable these kind of measurements. I mean, perhaps you know, perhaps you don't, but the underlying technology for all the genomics things we see today and transcriptomics is really microfluidics. These are all microfluidic technologies, and that's a very important direction. And microfluidics can also be applied for what you would call lab on a chip type technologies that could be applied to rapid diagnostics, high throughput diagnostics, as well as diagnostics in resource poor settings. So you can make really small miniaturized devices and then take them to areas where you cannot really find a lab to analyze your samples. And some of the challenges. So we really hope that some of these changes are not temporary. We don't want to go back to life as normal after these things pass. And some of the issues are always cultural and maybe regulatory. So you need to bring in all these different disciplines and different cultures together, engineers and doctors and scientists and regulatory people working together. And that's an issue. So let me give you an example. In terms of COVID, still 99% of all tests are still being done by nasal swabs. And there has been a lot of talk of saliva testing, and we have shown and others have shown that saliva is really a good testing medium. It's 100% accurate compared to nasal swabs. And yet, it is still not widely accepted. It's not the gold standard. And I don't think it's going to make an impact for COVID anytime soon. So this is just an example of a cultural issue and maybe / regulatory issue that makes the adoption of new developments difficult. That's one of the major challenges. And I would say the last major challenge is continuous funding in some of these areas. We don't want to go back to normal. We don't want to go back to our old habits. We need to find a way, either from governments, universities, or perhaps from the industry too, to come up with a better model, better research model, and better business model to continue working on these things, so that when the time comes, we're ready.
Great, thank you. And you can see with your example about how the importance of this team science approach is really there. Everything from all of the computational to the wet lab work to the microfluidics and all the engineering, things like that. So yes. Okay, last question before we get into the Q&A from our audience. So Annalisa, I'd like you to talk about which stakeholders should early stage healthcare diagnostic companies be thinking about right now, and why?
Sure. So patients, providers, hospitals are often the first stakeholders that a lot of early stage health diagnostic companies think of. But the most often overlooked stakeholder, in my opinion, are payers. I'm talking private payers, Medicare, Medicaid. And for those of you with regulated diagnostics, and if you think that getting through the FDA is difficult, obtaining reimbursement codes can make regulatory approval look like a walk in the park. I mean, it's very difficult, especially in terms of evidence generation and what is needed to actually cover that device. So, you know, even if you can demonstrate adoption and some outcomes, at the end of the day, really, no one wants to pay for the device, okay? They're pointing fingers. Someone else has to pay for it, right? And that someone else, you have to really sell to that person that you can save them something. You can save them, costs in the care of chronic disease patients. In the case of payers, for instance, maybe some hospital admissions. Payers love that. They want to reduce that. They want to reduce the emergency room trips too, reoperations. Those are a few things, that they'd want to see. So, my advice is, really pay attention to who is paying for your device.
How important is it to have a platform technology? You talked about your technology being platform. How important is that, especially for someone like Sean, as a venture capitalist who would be investing in you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think having a platform technology is very important. I said maybe about 5 minutes ago that, I'm in the thick of fundraising right now, and the investors I'm talking to, they say, that's great. What else do you got? And do you have any data in some of that other work on those other areas that you can claim that you can do? So I just think if your technology, and not every technology can do this, has the ability to cross multiple disciplines, it really is not only appealing to the investors, but it's also very appealing to your eventual acquirers of that sort of thing. It just makes you a really attractive candidate for acquisition.
Yes, and you talked a little bit about the importance of payers, and the importance of this kind of data for diagnostic companies to have. Is there anything else the diagnostic companies should have to be successful?
Yeah. I think the best type of data, in my opinion, are outcomes driven. And that really ties back to value propositions. And my colleagues here, we've talked about value propositions because it's really important to just get out there and talk to the different stakeholders, understand their unmet needs, and then demonstrate that you can address the needs. Are you improving patient care? Are you saving money? Prove it. Let's see the white papers. Let's see the published data in high impact journals, that sort of thing. It's kind of like, if you're buying on a much smaller scale, buying something off Amazon, you kind of look at the reviews and how many stars there are, right? So at a much larger scale, the clinicians, end users, that type of thing, they want to see, well, how's it been doing so far? Who else is using it? That sort of thing. So it's really important that you design the studies, by gathering a lot of input, and you really got to spend a lot of time developing that evidence generation plan to satisfy the different stakeholders, to satisfy the regulatory bodies, the public, the private payers, the end users, the clinicians, that sort of thing, because at the end of the day, your stakeholders are going to drive adoption.
Great insights. Thank you, Annalisa. We're next going to open this up to our audience and for you to ask questions. Their first question comes from Peter Fantozzi. Sorry, I said that wrong. So can you recall any examples when patient-centered interests seem to differ from the interests of key stakeholders, such as payers or providers? And how would you go about negotiating this tension?
Yeah, I can maybe throw out one without naming the company, but it was a diagnostic tool that used sort of a stronger or an advanced visualization technology to detect infection. And what was on the market today, or I would say the current standard of care, was providers would essentially take shots in the dark in terms of antibiotics. They would throw antibiotics at it, see what you reacted to. And the core value proposition of this company was, hey, we've got actually a better visualization tool, a diagnostic, which will help you target the right antibiotic. And so from a patient perspective, from a payer perspective, right, there's a lot of value in that, right? I can quickly, sort of speaks to that prognostic piece. I can quickly assess, I can quickly diagnose and figure out which antibiotic would work best so that this patient doesn't keep coming back with this infection. What was interesting from a provider perspective, the way the tool was positioned was it almost displaced the provider from the equation, right? It was able to say, your technician, all they have to do is take a picture, and you actually don't need any kind of provider analysis. The tool will automate all of that for you. So as you can imagine, physicians, providers who have gone to medical school, who have studied for many years, who want to use their analytical prowess to help patients like that, didn't actually find that value proposition to be that appealing, right? You're basically displacing me as an MD out of this equation, and you're using a tool to do it for me. So one challenge I know they had in that process was really educating the physician about, here's how you can use it, here's how your analytical skills can still be a part of this process. But what was good from a patient perspective, from a payer perspective, one thing they sort of forgot to think about was how was the provider, what was the provider role in all of this, and displacing them wasn't something that would drive adoption. So that's a great example of, sometimes it's not about the technology, it's actually about, I mentioned workflow, how does this fit within the workflow? Who are you displacing? What are you automating? And do all the stakeholders in that equation sort of agree with that process? So that's just maybe one general example I can share.
Wonderful, thank you. Next comes a question from Ozan Biran Akhturan, and he has a question directed toward Annalisa. Access to large specimens or data to demonstrate early value can be difficult. So what could early stage diagnostic startups do to overcome this challenge?
Sure. A couple of specific examples, and this is just based on other startups that I've been in that also have, had diagnostic technologies. I think, getting excised tissue from like tissue banks would be great, and there are definitely a lot of sources for that across the country. I've also have been a part of companies that have done prospective clinical trials where they were able to get fresher specimens during the surgery, where the company can be in a non-sterile field or next door or something, just so you can have fresher specimens as opposed to getting it from a tissue bank, that sort of thing. And I'm speaking mostly about just kind of human tissue. In terms of kind of like more animal tissue, what I've seen some startups do is they can come together and essentially share an animal, where you might be using one company might be using one part of the animal, and the other company might be using another part of vessel, that sort of thing. So there's different ways to collect some data, whether it's fresh, frozen, or whatnot.
Okay, wonderful. The next question comes from Hari Venkatram, and this is a question primarily, I think, for Sean, which is, how are health diagnostics innovation shaping telemedicine offerings? We didn't touch much on telemedicine. Certainly has exploded during COVID. So what are your thoughts?
I think that it'd actually be interesting to hear some of Arun's thoughts on this as well, since he's spoken into kind of the move to the point of care and so on. I think that actually, I imagine a number of people in this panel could weigh in a few ways. I think that our increasing ability to link some of our phenotypic data, including even what Arun was just speaking to, down to some of the more complex biology, it is enabling for telemedicine and remote medicine in a lot of ways. And I think streamlining and scaling down a lot of our diagnostics into kind of robust point of care will be a major part of that. I think that it's incredible the amount of information we can get these days and translate through from either our mobile devices or through what we're seeing in wearables and the improved sensors and sensitivity there. I think that it's an area that we're only going to see expand.
Great. Any other panelists want to weigh in on the question?
I'd say real quick, I think it was interesting the way that question was framed, because I almost think, telemedicine is almost shaping health diagnostic innovations, right? That this move that we have, obviously in COVID times, I think telemedicine is definitely, there's a piece of that that's here to stay. But there was always this need, especially in rural areas, for more telemedicine approaches. I think that's helping to drive more innovations, as we've talked about, things that are smaller, that have sort of these feedback loops, that are wearables, and that allow, I think, patients sort of this real-time monitoring and to be able to say, here's how I've been progressing over the course of these last few days. So I think the telemedicine is actually helping to drive a lot of the diagnostic innovations as well.
Wonderful. Okay, last question for all of our panelists. So Tejas Patel asked the question, what's the typical timeline from bench to bedside for diagnostics? And he's asking non-COVID diagnostics, given the advances the panel shared. So where do all of you touched this, where are we landing with typical timelines, ranges maybe of them? From the time you first start research, Savas, until the time in which you're starting to see this in the marketplace, Arun. So I'll start with Savas.
Yeah, I think it very much depends on the technology and really the cultural background. And I would say it's not less than 5 years and probably even longer. And some of the promising technologies, unfortunately, are never adopted to the bench, from bench to bedside. Yeah.
Okay. I'll go with Annalisa next. She'd be the next step in this.
Yeah, it really does depend. I guess it depends on how, developed the, early prototype, is out of the lab, for instance. I've seen companies, take just a couple of years. I've seen companies take 10 years. It really depends on, what clinical need you're addressing, the use case of that device, that sort of thing. But let's say, after, you have the kind of like the proof of concept and you demonstrated feasibility, then you enter commercial world, and that really is variable too. If the device is regulated in what classification, so there's a lot of variability in that. But certainly you can get some help along the way from external consultants, in the respective fields.
Sean, you're next.
Sure, I would echo a bit of what we've heard here. It really it depends on the technology. It depends on the readiness of not just the technology, but also of payers. You asked earlier about how do you work with payers? Sometimes if something is ready to move right in, does this mean that how differentiated might this technology be? Is it something where it's based on profound new insight into biology, or is it something where someone might be able to chase you relatively quickly down the regulatory approval path? And how do these payers look at it? Will you now be able to reap the benefits of the value that you're creating? What would scale need to look like for you? So oftentimes we do see when we do base these companies around a more fundamental scientific insight, oftentimes the timelines can be relatively long because there's really the initial development of the technology and the broad adoption outside of diagnostics before as Annalisa spoke to, you end up generating a platform that then can butt off into a number of different diagnostic opportunities, which really pushes the value. But you can imagine that means these things can be a bit of a longer term play.
Yeah. Lastly, Arun.
Yeah, I would say it really goes back to that value proposition story of your solution, right? So if your solution is something that is meant to be informative, right? Your output is sort of a piece of information versus you are helping to make a diagnostic assessment versus you are making a prognostic assessment. That is kind of what changes or impacts your timeline. So things that are informative, you could probably develop something fairly quickly and utilize it. But again, as you get, as Annalisa mentioned, kind of get into the regulatory sphere, that's where the timelines start to extend. That's where you need to demonstrate data. There are some diagnostics that even need clinical trials to determine to back up some of their claims around the prognostic claims. So really it does depend, I would say, starting with a very clear understanding of where your solution fits in that process, what the value proposition is, and that'll dictate a lot of sort of the timing it takes to get it to market.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to close by thanking all of our panelists, Arun, Sean, Spas, Annalisa, for your wonderful insights. Great preparation. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back now to Nima, who is going to talk about next things for the Entrepreneurial Outlook series.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to our panelists. This was a fantastic discussion today. For those that are still on the line with us, please go ahead and fill out the survey for the event. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's panel. And then also, please be sure to join us for the next Entrepreneurial Outlook next Friday, February 12th at noon on Media and Entertainment. And be sure to check our website, check out our website, polsky.uchicago.edu, to learn about other events, mentorship, and Polsky On Demand, a library of some of our offerings. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.